I still remember the day my father told me, humans were never meant to know what lies beneath the ocean floor. If you keep digging, you'll regret it. What he never mentioned was how he and I would soon become unwilling puppets of something older and hungrier than anything I'd ever imagined. A presence that demanded the darkest of sacrifices. But before I unleash this chilling secret, let me ask you to do something really quick. If you haven't already, subscribe to Whisper Village right now. There are many more nerve-wracking bedtime stories waiting for you. And trust me, you do not want to face these nightmares alone. The rain pattered against my bedroom window every night, an endless lullaby that reminded me of a heartbeat. I used to find it soothing, the way storms lulled me into dreamless sleep. But after what happened, I can't sleep without hearing something else. The faint echo of my father's words, drifting through those thunderclaps and swirling winds. I was 13 when we moved to the old beach house. It stood perched on a low cliff overlooking the restless Atlantic. The yard was a wild tangle of dune grass and driftwood. Gulls cried overhead, and the wind carried the sharp scent of salt across the porch. Even on sunny days, the place felt cloaked in perpetual twilight. "Get inside," Father said one afternoon when a storm brewed offshore. His voice was eerily calm, the kind of calmness that always meant trouble. "A storm is coming." My mother, who rarely disagreed with him, ushered me into the house, her face pale with apprehension. It was a small cottage, cramped and reeking of mildew. But Father insisted it was temporary, a chance to live cheaply while renovating a bigger home inland. I believed him at first. He always had a plan, or so I thought. By midnight that very day, the storm was at its peak. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning illuminated the entire coastline. During a particularly bright flash, I glimpsed him outside, standing near the cliff's edge. Rain hammered against his soaked clothes, but he didn't flinch. His head was tilted toward the sea, as if he was listening to something beyond the roar of the waves. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tense, like he was awaiting an answer. I'd seen him do this before, though never in such violent conditions. He was obsessed with the ocean's secrets. Whenever I asked him about it, he'd respond, "One day, you'll see for yourself." I didn't know then just how horrific that truth would be. From the day I was old enough to remember, Father was fascinated with what he called the old knowledge. He kept a ragged notebook with strange markings in it, some in English, others in runes I couldn't decipher. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, references to local legends, sea monsters, old sailors' tales of chanting coming from the depths. Some nights, he'd stay in his study until dawn, poring over them by the flickering glow of an ancient lamp. My mother often sat with me in the living room, pretending to read or do cross-stitch, but her gaze would drift anxiously toward the study door. She never told me the whole story of Father's obsession, but her silence spoke volumes. I tried once to ask her, "Mom, what's he looking for? It's not something dangerous, is it?" She hesitated, her voice trembling. He thinks there's something in the water that shouldn't be disturbed. But why does he keep? That's enough, honey." She forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "Help me with the dishes." That night, I crept downstairs while everyone was asleep. I pressed my ear against Father's study door, heart pounding at the possibility he might catch me. I heard the steady scratch of his pen, the rustle of old papers, and occasionally, words spoken so softly I couldn't understand them. But one phrase was clear enough to set my nerves on edge. The watchers beneath must appease them. Lightning flared outside, briefly illuminating the hall. My shadow slid across the door, and I panicked. I hurried back to my room, the thunder rumbling like the growl of a giant beast. I dreamed that night of the sea swallowing the entire house, of twisted shapes swimming in the deep, eyes glimmering with hunger, of my father kneeling at the shoreline, chanting words I couldn't comprehend. It would be a long while before I understood the significance of that dream. A week after we settled in, I woke to the acrid smell of burning. A low hiss and crackle snaked its way from the living room. Heart hammering, I rushed out of bed. The moment I left my room, I could feel an unnerving chill creeping along the hallway floor. I found Father hunched over the fireplace, tossing in a bundle of damp seaweed. The living room stank of rotting kelp and something else, an odor like decayed fish. He looked up at me with glassy eyes. "Go back to bed. What are you doing?" I asked, stifling a cough as the smoke seared my nostrils. He ignored me, returning to the mesmerizing dance of the flames. "The seaweed must burn, or the Watchers will come looking." The Watchers. That word again, repeating like a doomed refrain. I shivered, unsure if he was joking or if this was just another one of his bizarre rituals. The next morning, the remnants of scorched seaweed lay in the ashes. The living room windows cracked open to let in the briny breeze. My mother refused to talk about it. She busied herself with chores, carefully avoiding any mention of Father's nighttime activities. For dinner, we had leftover soup, and Father barely spoke. He just stared at me from across the table, his gaze heavy with expectation, as if waiting for me to comment on his strange behavior. But I said nothing. I just spooned cold broth to my lips, feeling my stomach twist. That night, I couldn't sleep. I heard the oceans roar outside, thrashing against the cliff. The wind moaned through the eaves. My father's footsteps creaked in the hallway, coming to a stop outside my door. For several excruciating moments, all I could hear was his breathing, slow, measured. I could almost feel his presence through the thin wooden door. Then, just like that, he moved on. Outside, the storm was building again, the sky filling with dark clouds. The sound of thunder rolled in over the waves. I pressed my pillow over my ears, trying to drown it all out. But the real storm was inside my head, growing heavier with each new question. What if Father was right? What if there was something down there, lurking in the salty darkness, responding to his bizarre offerings? The next morning, I noticed a fresh line in his notebook. It read, "The Watchers grow hungry. Must prepare the child." I confronted my mother a few days later, cornering her in the kitchen while Father was out by the shore, rummaging through seaweed and tide pools. The floors squeaked under my feet as I approached. She was scrubbing dishes, and her knuckles were almost white from the effort. "Mom," I began, my voice quivering with a blend of fear and frustration. "He's talking about Watchers, about preparing a child. Do you know what that means? Does it have anything to do with me?" She froze, her shoulders tensed. I saw her reflection in the window above the sink, eyes wide, tears threatening to spill. She swallowed hard. "It's complicated. Your father, he had a difficult childhood. His father believed in the old ways, in superstitions passed down for generations." She turned off the tap, letting the water drain with a hollow gurgle. "He used to tell me, when we first got married, that his family had a burden to bear, something about an ancient pact with the sea, but I never believed any of it. It sounded like nonsense, delusions. But what if it isn't nonsense?" I asked, voice trembling. "He's getting worse. Mom, I'm scared." She hugged me close, her apron damp against my cheek. The comforting smell of dish soap did little to wash away the dread. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "Just stay away from him if he starts acting strange." I wanted to demand more, but I could feel her trembling. Fear was a living thing in that house, feeding on our uncertainty. In that moment, I realized my mother was as powerless as I was. Whatever was happening, we were both caught in its undertow, drifting further from the safety of reason. Outside, I heard Father's distant voice over the crashing surf, chanting something in a language that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep well that night. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the steady drip of the faucet in the bathroom, like a metronome ticking away the seconds before the next storm. At some point, I wondered if I'd ever feel truly safe again. One afternoon, after another restless night, I decided I needed to see Father's study for myself. Truly see it, not just listen at the door. When he went out to the cliffs, presumably to gather more seaweed or to perform another strange ritual, I slipped into the study. It was dim, the blinds half shut. The air felt clammy, like the inside of a cave. Stacks of old books lined the shelves, titles like Tales of the Deep, Mariner's Hexes, and The Drowned Gods. My heart thumped as I ran my fingers over the cracked leather spines. On the desk lay his ragged notebook, open to a page filled with intricate sketches. I recognized the shapes as tentacles, curling, sinuous limbs spiraling around a monstrous, faceless head. My throat tightened. In the margin, Father had scribbled a single word repeatedly. Ixhaley, Ixhaley, Ixhaley. Near the bottom was a hastily drawn map of our coastline, marked with an X just beyond the cliff. Next to it, in small, scrawled letters, were the words, "Ritual must be completed by the new moon. The Watchers demand a life." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. A life. No wonder he'd been talking about preparing a child. But was it meant to be me, or someone else? My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the notebook. I flipped further back and found pages detailing the legend of some ancient sea entity. Fragments of text read, "Awakened by blood, an offering of innocence." My stomach lurched. The more I read, the clearer it became. Father was convinced that, to appease whatever lurked out there, someone had to be sacrificed. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a cry. Could he really believe this madness? And even if he did, would he actually go through with it? In my panic, I nearly missed the locked drawer in the corner of the room. Curiosity overrode my fear. I jiggled the handle. It was sealed tight. Desperate, I rummaged through Father's desk for a key, eventually finding one hidden beneath a pile of old letters. My heart hammered in my chest as I slid it into the lock. It clicked open. Inside lay a small photograph of Father as a child, standing on the same beach behind our house. Next to him stood a man I presumed was my grandfather, holding a large fish knife. Behind them, the ocean swirled darkly, ominous waves cresting in the background. Both of them wore matching expressions, equal parts wonder and terror. Beneath the photo was a single piece of paper with a crimson smear along one edge. Written in a cramped, shaky hand were the words, "We tried to fight it, but the Watchers never forget. The next generation must pay the debt." The edges of my vision blurred. I returned everything to its place, locked the drawer, and fled the study, adrenaline making me lightheaded. A dozen questions buzzed in my mind. If we were part of some ancient pact, who could possibly help us? We were alone out here, under the thrall of the ocean. And my father, he was determined to fulfill his family's horrifying obligation. Days blurred together after that discovery. The sky remained gloomy, rain pelting the windows in a near-constant drizzle, as if nature itself was mourning what was soon to come. I could hardly look my father in the eye. I tried telling my mother about the notebook, the photo, the mention of a sacrifice, but she only squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head. "You must have misunderstood," she whispered, though her face was ghostly pale. "He wouldn't hurt you. He loves you. He's not well." Deep down, I think she knew better. I avoided Father as much as possible. When he wandered to the cliffs, chanting under his breath, I locked myself in my room. When he worked in his study at night, I huddled beneath the covers, praying the next flash of lightning wouldn't illuminate some ghastly figure at my window. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't outrun his gaze. One evening, we were forced to share dinner. I poked at the soggy casserole, my appetite long gone. Father, too, barely ate. He just watched me with that disconcerting intensity, eyes shining in the dim light of the overhead lamp. "Son," he said abruptly, his voice gravelly, "you look pale. Aren't you sleeping?" My mother's hand went rigid on her fork. I forced a casual shrug. "Nightmares," I muttered, not wanting to elaborate. He nodded solemnly. "I know about nightmares. Sometimes they're warnings, you know." He cast a sidelong glance at Mom. "You do well to heed them." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table, interrupted only by the drip of the kitchen faucet into the sink. Father's expression was unreadable, but I sensed an undercurrent of guilt laced with determination, a fanatic's resolve. Later that night, he cornered me in the hallway. "I know you've been in my study," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the stillness of the house. My mouth went dry. He held up a hand. "No need to lie. I can feel it. The Watchers can feel it too. They know when someone uninitiated pries into their mysteries." His eyes roamed over my face, searching for something. "You're not ready to face them." He let that statement hang in the air before retreating to his room. I stood there, rooted in place, my mind racing with dread. Father was no longer just a harmless eccentric. He was a ticking time bomb of dark conviction, guided by something I couldn't begin to comprehend. That night, I finally understood. If I stayed under this roof much longer, I might be the offering. But I didn't know how to escape, or if it was even possible with the Watchers lurking beneath the waves, whispering my name. The night of the new moon approached. I tracked it on the calendar religiously, each passing day feeling like a step closer to my doom. The skies grew heavier, the ocean restless, and Father's behavior more unhinged. On the eve of the new moon, a storm unlike any I'd witnessed descended upon us. The wind shrieked, bending the old cypress trees behind the house nearly double. Rain battered the windows so fiercely I feared they'd shatter. And through it all, Father paced from room to room, chanting in that unknown tongue. Occasionally, he'd pause at the front window, peering out at the raging sea, face set in grim purpose. Mom stayed in her bedroom, door locked. I sat on the living room couch, hugging my knees to my chest, counting the minutes between thunderclaps. Midnight came and went, and the power flickered, plunging the house in a momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, Father was standing in the hallway, a lantern in one hand, the ragged notebook in the other. "It's time," he said softly, turning his gaze on me. My throat felt tight. "Time for what?" He lowered his voice to a near hiss. "The Watchers demand a vessel. We must go." I sprang to my feet, heart thumping. "No, I'm not. I'm not going anywhere with you." He tilted his head, his eyes reflecting a distant, alien sympathy. "If we don't appease them tonight, they will take more than just one life. The entire coast will tremble." Tears stung my eyes. "I don't believe you. You're sick, obsessed." He regarded me for a tense moment, then turned toward the back door. "You will come," he said, "or your mother will, and they might prefer her." My stomach flipped. I knew I had no choice. My mother was fragile, terrified, caught in Father's web of madness. If anyone could break free, maybe it was me. Summoning the small courage I had left, I followed him outside, into the storm. The rain slapped against our skin as we headed down the path toward the cliffs. Lightning sliced across the sky, revealing the furious waves below. Father led the way, his lantern a feeble glow against the wrath of nature. "This is insane," I thought, each step feeling heavier, like I was trudging through wet cement. We reached the edge, where the rocky outcrop jutted over the churning sea. Father held the lantern high, illuminating a narrow set of steps carved into the cliffside. The old stone steps descended precariously to a hidden cove below. "Be careful," he shouted over the howling wind. "One wrong step, and you're lost to the sea." I wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the house, barricade myself inside. But I could only see my mother's face, pale with dread. If I left, Father would come back for her next. So I followed him down the slippery steps, my heart pounding at the precarious drop to my left. Thunder boomed overhead, like the roar of a vengeful god. The cove was a narrow inlet, shielded by towering rocks. The waves surged, casting frothy spray into the air. Father made his way to a large rock formation that jutted above the waterline. There, half submerged, was an entrance to what looked like a cave. "We must go inside," Father said, gripping my shoulder. His eyes shone with a fervor that chilled me to the core. "They're waiting." I never knew such a cave existed along our shore. Perhaps it was only accessible during low tide, or maybe Father's ancestors had carved it out years ago. Either way, Stepping inside felt like crossing into another realm. The walls glistened with brine and algae, and the echoes of dripping water reverberated off the jagged ceiling. The further we ventured, the more the roar of the storm outside faded, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by the occasional hollow drip. Father held his lantern aloft, its flame a weak, flickering orb in the darkness. Water pooled around our ankles, cold enough to numb my toes. Shadows danced along the rock walls, creating the illusion of sinuous shapes twisting just beyond sight. At last, we reached a cavernous chamber. The space was wide enough to accommodate a small house. The floor rose above sea level, revealing an ancient stone slab at the center. Around it, someone had placed pillars of petrified wood or coral, no bones. My heart lurched as I realized these pillars were not natural formations, but carefully arranged vertebrae from some massive sea creature, bleached white as a tombstone. Father approached the slab, setting the lantern down on a rocky ledge. He opened his notebook and began reciting a chant, each syllable dripping with malice. My pulse hammered, sweat mingling with the sea spray on my skin. "Father, stop," I begged. "This is insane. There's nothing here." No sooner had I spoken those words than a low rumble seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The dripping stalactites vibrated, sending rivulets of water down our backs. Father's chant rose in volume, echoing like a grotesque choir of one. And then I heard it, a distant scraping noise, like claws on stone. It came from deeper within the cave, from a tunnel that vanished into absolute blackness. Every hair on my body stood on end. "They are coming," Father said, voice trembling. Whether from fear or reverence, I couldn't tell. I took a step back, my instincts screaming to flee. But the path behind us led to a storm-lashed shore, and Father blocked me from running deeper into the tunnel. I was trapped. Suddenly, the water at our feet rippled. Something large moved just beneath the surface. My blood ran cold. I strained to see in the dim lantern light, half expecting a grotesque tentacle to emerge. Instead, a figure rose from the water. Humanoid, yet impossibly elongated, its skin the color of rotted kelp. It didn't speak, but its eyes glowed with an otherworldly luminescence that pinned me in place. I could feel the ocean inside its stare, ancient and unyielding. A primal fear seized me. Father sank to his knees on the slippery rock, arms wide in supplication. "I bring you the offering," he cried, gesturing toward me. "Spare our bloodline, O watchers of the deep." My mouth went dry. Every cell in my body screamed in terror as the creature advanced, water dripping from its limbs, leaving a slick trail. Father's chanting continued, building to a fever pitch. I tried to speak, to beg for my life, but the horror was too great. Then something in my mind snapped. I refused to be sacrificed without a fight. My eyes darted around the cavern, finally settling on a large, broken stalactite lying near the stone slab, a jagged, heavy piece of rock. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I lunged for it. The moment my fingers closed around the sharp rock, Father whirled on me. "No," he shouted, voice cracking with rage. "You'll doom us all." But I was beyond reason. Survival instincts drove me. With a desperate cry, I swung the stalactite at the approaching sea creature, aiming for its head. It staggered backward, letting out a shrill hiss that rattled the cavern walls. Father lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a vice grip. He tried to wrench the weapon from my grasp. "This is bigger than you, boy. We have a debt. Centuries old." I thrashed against him. "I'm not your sacrifice." The creature recovered, gliding closer, black ichor oozing from a gash where I'd struck it. Father and I stumbled, crashing onto the wet stone. The lantern clattered against the ground, its glass cracking but not extinguishing the flame. Shadows flickered madly across the walls, like 1,000 dancing phantoms. I fought back tears, locked in a deadly struggle with the man who was supposed to protect me. My father's eyes shone with desperate fanaticism. I'm sorry, he gasped. I have no choice. His grip tightened, and I felt my strength ebbing. Another hiss tore through the cavern. The creature was nearly upon us, elongated arms reaching out. I summoned every ounce of willpower, twisting my body at an awkward angle, smashing Father in the face with my elbow. He grunted, momentarily stunned, his hold loosening just enough for me to scramble free. Without pausing, I heaved the stalactite at the creature's torso. It let out a guttural shriek, stumbling back into the dark water. The resulting splash echoed, and for a brief second, it disappeared beneath the surface. Breathing hard, I saw Father lying there, dazed, blood trickling from his nose. He stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "You fool," he rasped. "You can't kill it. Nothing can." Thunder boomed from outside, sending tremors through the cave. The water level around our ankles rose ominously. The tide was coming in. Soon, this chamber would be flooded. The Watchers, and that monstrous being, would have the advantage. I tried to focus on the immediate goal, escape, but Father lurched forward, grabbing my leg. "You won't leave," he growled, voice choked with madness. "You'll finish what we started." Panic flared in my chest. I kicked him hard, freeing myself from his grip. He made a feeble attempt to catch me again, but I was quicker, adrenaline surging through my veins. I sprinted toward the entrance, the lantern flame flickering behind me like a dying star. Each step sent cold sprays of water up my legs, the tide hungrily rising to swallow me whole. From behind, I heard Father's pitiful scream. It was a sound torn from the depths of a man's soul, a final wail of regret and desperation. Against my better judgment, I glanced back. The creature had risen from the water once more. It towered over him, luminous eyes boring into his very essence. Father tried to speak, but only a ragged sob emerged. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Father looked at me with something akin to clarity in his gaze, like he finally understood the gravity of what he'd done. The Watchers demanded payment, and if it wasn't me, perhaps it would be him. My stomach churned at the realization. With a sickening lunge, the creature wrapped a slick arm around his torso, dragging him toward the submerged tunnel. Father's screams reverberated through the cavern, then gurgled into silence as the water closed over his head. I should have been relieved to be free, but horror overwhelmed me, turning my insides to ice. For a second, all I could do was stand there, chest heaving, mind reeling. Then the cave shook, a surge of water rushing in, and I knew I had to run or drown. Fighting the rising current, I stumbled back through the cave entrance, into the tempest raging outside. Rain pelted my face like needles. The wind nearly toppled me over. Waves crashed violently against the rocky walls, sending bursts of salt water spraying overhead. The steps cut into the cliff were submerged in places, making each footfall precarious. Lightning flashed, revealing a silhouette that made my heart jolt. My mother, standing at the top of the steps, a flashlight in her trembling hand. She'd come looking for me. For us. "Mom!" I screamed, the wind snatching the word from my lips. I clutched a jutting rock, pulling myself up one step at a time. When at last I reached her, she wrapped her arms around me, so tightly I could barely breathe. "Where's?" she began, voice breaking. I couldn't form the words. Instead, I just shook my head. The tears mingled with rain, stinging my eyes. We fought our way back up the cliffside, the storm relentless, the darkness pressing in on all sides. By the time we reached the house, we were soaked to the bone. My mother locked the door behind us, though we both knew a simple lock was no protection against the Watchers of the deep. I collapsed on the floor, knees drawn to my chest. She knelt beside me, hands shaking. What would happen in there? My throat felt raw. Father tried to offer me, but something else took him instead. Her face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Oh God, what have we done?" We sat there in stunned silence, the thunder rolling overhead like a cosmic drumbeat. The house groaned, battered by the wind and rain. My mind whirled with the images I'd witnessed. The monstrous creature, its gleaming eyes, my father's final scream. And then, for the first time, I heard something at the window, a faint tap, 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 like fingers rapping against the glass. We both looked, dread chilling our blood. Through the warped reflection of the storm-lashed night, we saw nothing. But the tapping persisted. Slowly, I stood, creeping toward the window. My mother clung to my sleeve, whispering for me not to go. I lifted the curtain. The space was empty save for the swirling darkness. But that hollow knock continued. It felt more like a message than just random noise. "We know where you are." We stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled together in the living room, furniture pushed against the doors and windows. I flipped off all the lights, hoping the darkness would hide us. Every gust of wind, every rattle of the house made my heart leap. At some point, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. My dreams were a whirlpool of terror. Father's frantic eyes, the watcher's glowing stare, the suffocating depths of the ocean. I jolted awake at dawn, the storm finally dying outside to a light drizzle. My mother dozed next to me, tear-streaked cheeks pressed against a damp pillow. I peered out the window, half expecting to see something monstrous on the beach. But all was quiet, the sun hidden behind leaden clouds. The tide had receded, leaving glistening seaweed strewn across the shore. Yet no trace of my father or the creature remained. With trembling determination, I got up and unblocked the door. The damp morning air was thick with the smell of salt and decaying kelp. Cautiously, I ventured outside, scanning the beach. Waves lapped at the sand with an almost gentle sigh, as if the previous night's tempest was just a bad dream. But it was no dream, and I knew, beyond any doubt, that something unspeakable had claimed my father. And it was still out there, somewhere waiting. We left the Sea House behind soon after that night. We abandoned our belongings, taking only the bare essentials. My mother didn't say a word as we drove inland, the coastline fading in the rearview mirror. The sky was still overcast, but I felt a fragile sense of relief. At least we were away from that cursed shore. For months, nightmares plagued me. I'd wake in a cold sweat, certain I could hear the watcher's hissing call. Rain on the roof sounded like nails scratching. Waves breaking sounded like moans in the distance. My mother and I tried to rebuild our lives in a modest apartment far from the ocean, but the shadows of the past loomed large. I once visited the local library, desperate for any information about the Watchers, about Ix Haley, about a lineage that owed a debt to the sea. I found only fragments of folklore and half-myths, tales warning of spirits that punished those who pried into the ocean's secrets. None of it gave me closure. None of it explained what truly happened to Father, or what might happen next. Even now, years later, whenever it rains heavily at night, I find myself standing by the window, heart pounding, searching the darkness for that indescribable shape. I've tried to put the pieces together. Maybe Father was drawn into madness, chasing an ancient superstition. Or maybe he stumbled on something real, something monstrous that demanded a tribute. All I know for certain is that something in the water had claimed him, and for reasons I can't fully understand, it let me go. Maybe it was his final act of paternal love, sacrificing himself instead. Or maybe it was all part of a bigger design, something waiting, biding its time. Because whenever the storms rage and the wind howls, I swear I can still hear that distant tapping on the window, reminding me that the Watchers never truly sleep. Some nights, I wonder if the sea will come calling for me again, if the Watchers will demand the continuation of that sinister pact. And when that thought crosses my mind, I sleep with the lights on, the patter of rain no longer a lullaby, but a dark omen of ancient things stirring beneath the waves. So, if you ever find yourself alone on a stormy night, listening to the relentless beat of rain on your window, remember my story. Sometimes, the darkest nightmares don't come from within our minds. They crawl from the ocean's depths, older than time and hungry for the fear we so willingly provide. Thank you for listening to this harrowing tale from Whisper Village. If you found yourself enthralled and trembling with every thunderclap, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next terrifying bedtime story. And remember, if the tide ever whispers your name at midnight, ignore it. Some secrets are better left buried beneath the waves. Sleep well if you can,